Before this video starts, I'd just like to make an announcement. I have the Liberal Tears mug for $14.99 on my website. It is the first link in the description if you want to go pick one up. Don't worry if it breaks when it comes to your house. I'll send you another one for free out of my pocket. I don't care. I want you to get your Liberal Tear mug. It comes in Liberal Tears white with the face, black with the face, white without the face, and black without the face. So pick whichever one you want, and it'll come to your door in about 3 to 5 days. So that should be epic. First link in the description. Thank you. Let's go on with the video.
Nazis! You are Nazis!
Okay, that was a disruption of Friday's performance of Shakespeare in the Park's production of Julius Caesar. The production was controversial, one because they had Caesar, who is killed, resemble the president.
Donald Trump. They had one that resembled Barack Obama several years ago.
The protesters called it, quote, the normalization of political violence against the right, and the blood of Steve Scalise is on your hands. The production closed yesterday, but not without being disrupted again by supporters of the president. Joining us from Los Angeles, we have editor-in-chief of DailyWire.com, columnist Ben Shapiro. Over the weekend, he criticized these protests from the right, saying they adopt the tactics of the left, and Charlie Sykes is still with us.
Yeah, Charlie's still with us. So Ben, we've been criticizing, what happened up at Middlebury, and I say we around the set, but also conservatives have. What's happening in Berkeley all the time. And then, as you pointed out, these people in the alt-right have hijacked some of the worst traits of the far left and what they did with this play. Talk about it.
I've spent my career opposing idiot snowflakery. I go around and I speak at places like Cal State Los Angeles, and there's a near riot there. I go and speak at University of Wisconsin. People try to storm the stage, and I've always said, this kind of stuff is not free speech when you're trying to censor somebody else's free speech. And then the right does it, and shockingly, there are members of the right, mainstream members of the right, who says, well, this is just turnabout as fair play. Well, no, if it's wrong when the left does it, it's wrong when you do it. And this idiotic notion that trying to promote snowflakery from the right is somehow going to combat the snowflakery from the left, it's so stupid, especially because this stuff hasn't actually helped the left. I mean, even Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren came out against Antifa and people trying to shut down Ann Coulter at Berkeley. If the right starts to embrace the same tactics that some members of the left have embraced in shutting down free speech in the name of shutting down hate speech, then the right is going to be just as guilty as the left in this political impasse we now find ourselves in.
And you were getting bashed all weekend, I saw, not really from the right. It's not the right. They're not conservatives. It's the alt-right.
Well, that's no shock. I mean, the alt-right is not a right-wing movement. The alt-right is basically a grievance movement that is driven in response to the multicultural left, and they are promoting, again, this notion that two wrongs make a right, and that if the left does it, we should do it because that means that we're going to be fighting back against the left. Look, the best way to fight back against things that are bad is to do good things. It is not to do equally bad things in exactly the same way.
You'd hope the president would hear that.
Charlie, it's Nick Compasori. So a question for you and for Ben. I've always suspected that part of what's happening here with the alt-right, but also with the old conservative talk radio world, is the profit motive, right? On the alt-right, you have these new media stars, and they're driven to these stunts. And I wonder how much of what we're seeing here is trying to appeal and fire folks up just to make some money.
Well, there's two elements here, and Ben is absolutely right. I mean, first of all, you just have the dumb extremism there. I mean, my advice is, people, you need to read a damn book once in a while. It's William Shakespeare. But you're absolutely right. Almost all of the incentives now on the extremes of the media are for these kinds of, be the most bombastic, the most reckless, stage these kinds of stunts, because you would normally think you would take a deep breath and go, do conservatives who have spent so long making the case for tolerance and free speech, do you really want to now be storming the stage of a William Shakespeare play to shout it down? Does this make any sense? Now, this may make sense in the minds of people like Sean Hannity, but really.
And the moral of the play, by the way, is not that he's assassinated and it all turns out great.
No.
So the moral of the play is he's killed and everything goes to pot.
Right. And Ben,
how many of these people have read this play?
You have to read.
But how many of these protesters have actually read this play? How many could tell you what century William Shakespeare wrote, what century Julius Caesar lived? This is actually This is cringeworthy, but, you know, apparently some people have figured out that they're going to be able to monetize this, get clicks, get a little bit of notoriety.
Well, and you know,
the incentives that exist.
Charlie makes a great point, and I'm not making fun of your age. I wish I was as young as you are, but old guys like us, Mike Lupica and
definitely
and
Mike
others,
Lupica.
we can remember back in the 1980s, late 1980s, one of the most important books.
Old guy.
One of the most important was The Closing of the American Mind. And we conservatives were fighting against this type of behavior. We conservatives were fighting against this type of behavior in the 1980s, the closing of the American mind. So after fighting that fight for 30 years, why would we adopt their tactics, Ben?
So true.
Well, I think that some members of the right have now been driven to extremes by a feeling of frustration, which is not justified. I think right now what we're seeing also is just an attempt to appeal to anger and extremism on both sides because of profit motive, because of political motive, and whether it's Joy Reid saying what she said about Steve Scalise or whether it's what's going on at the Julius Caesar play. The fact is right now everybody is making bank off the anger of a public because you always make money off of justifying, making people feel better about their anger. In truth, we should be asking people, okay, maybe your anger is just not that justified, okay? The fact is that if there's a play going on that you don't like, you have the option of putting on a counterplay, you have the option of protesting outside, but this notion that we can shut down each other's speech because we don't like what's being said, this is the end of the First Amendment in practice, if not in law, and what that means is that we are going to come to blows at a pretty clear point here.
Well, there's a lot of amendments to the Constitution that may be a threat to us right now. The First Amendment is not one of them. I've said to Josh before, sometimes the First Amendment's like a great big rock, and when you lift it up, some really lousy things come crawling out from underneath it. But unfortunately, we have to protect their rights.
Guess what? That's the purpose of the First Amendment.
You bet.
That's right.
You bet.
That's the whole
And
point.
so
the entire point is to allow, you know, one of the cases that we studied, one of the first things we studied in constitutional law, Josh, were Nazis having the First Amendment right to march in Illinois, despite the fact it was deeply offensive to just about everybody.
There's a benefit to our society to surfacing these ideas so we can expose them, we can debate about them, and we can make a collective decision as a society what's right and what's wrong. So if you have so much confidence and conviction in your point of view, then why not allow it to share the state and debate it with someone else?
Why shut it down?
Well, I'll go to both of our guests on remote and just ask you both. We all agree, there's great consensus around the table about this problem. I know neither one of you is a public policy maker, but what's the thing that could transpire that would turn the tide and bring us back? Charlie, why don't you go first on this? What can be done to reverse this trend?
The trend of intolerance? Well, again, you know, stick to the principle that in fact ideas and words should not be shouted down. We should not embrace the heckler's veto. You know, and what's really startling about this is people like Ben Shapiro have been so eloquent and been so high profile in saying that conservatives support the First Amendment. Look, if there's a Venn diagram between left and right about the things that we share, it's probably a small overlap, but you would think that tolerance and free speech would be among the things that we agree on.
But Ben, you make the point basically that the market incentives now are towards intolerance. So how do we reverse those market incentives, because the market incentives are very powerful?
Well, eventually it's going to come back down to the voters, and it's come back down to us, the consumers. We're going to have to determine that words are not violence unless they expressly advocate violence. And this is a dangerous thing the left has embraced for 20 years, and now the right is starting to embrace it too. This idea that people we don't like when they say things, that's what's driving people to violence. And once we feel that, once we equate words with violence, then pretty soon we're going to be equating violence with violence, because it's not just going to stay words.
Oh my gosh,
All right.
The Closing of the American Mind.
Closing-
I'm so old too.
You remember that?
Oh my gosh.
Closing
yes,
of the
I
American
do.
Mind in
Charlie Sykes, Ben Shapiro.
1989.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much.
Very uplifting conversation to end the morning on.
That does it for us this morning.
Thanks so much. Happy to take your questions. And as I say, if you disagree, then I'm always eager to talk with people who disagree, because it's fun to have discussions. So you get to go first if you disagree.
Well, I didn't expect the first one down here, but I disagree with you on a couple points, Ben.
Sure.
First, let me introduce myself. My name is Cash Jackson. I'm a retired Navy veteran. And
well, thank you for your service.
Thank you. I am also intending on running for governor 2018 here in the state of Illinois. And I wanted to specifically address where you spoke about victimization and people coming from impoverished neighborhoods, that poverty wasn't kind of what you equated to for criminal activity, and that addressing crime by putting more police into these inner city communities would be the resolution to said criminal activity. I just want to challenge that thought process on a couple of points.
Sure.
Beginning with my personal opinion, and some of this is going to be rooted in facts and others just in my observations,
That's fine.
is that the majority of crime that's being committed in these inner city neighborhoods, if we look at prison statistics, if we look at gang violence, we look at drug abuse, we look at teen pregnancy, suicide and depression amongst our youth, there's one common denominator. That common denominator is that these children are growing up in fatherless homes. They're growing up in fatherless homes not because fathers are not present and because we have a plethora of deadbeat fathers, which has been painted through through the media, that there's millions of deadbeat fathers out there. That's simply not the truth. What is the truth is that the states have found it profitable by misappropriating Title IV funding through the Social Security Act from the federal government down to the states. The states take a parent, which is historically and statistically the father, they relegate them down to a visitor during a custody proceeding, such as my case. So I hope that you can smear this over your website. They reduce me down to a visitor status to justify a child support order. When they do that and they force that collection process, they receive federal funding directly to the state.
Okay, so sorry, I don't want to break up the long paragraphs there, but you know more about custody battles than I do. Okay, I will just say that obviously custody battles only take place in a situation in which there's a conflict between the spouses. I mean, I assume that you and your spouse don't get along great.
Well,
I mean,
let me finish just addressing. I know I'm long-winded.
Sorry, one more comment. The fact is that it is not custody battles. The custody battles are not the reason 70% of black kids are born out of wedlock and 40% of white kids are born out of wedlock. It's because people are having sex out of wedlock and having babies.
That's correct. But when that child support order is put in place, okay, in order to justify the support order, they have to take one parent, which historically is the father, and say, you're only going to get every other weekend. And when we do that, we have set the stage for emotional and mental challenges for those individuals. And again, if you look at teen pregnancy statistics, drug abuse statistics.
So I agree with you about the correlation between all these terrible things and single motherhood. I just disagree with you statistically that cases of father visitation in divorce cases represent even a large minority of the cases of single motherhood. Again, the vast majority of, if we're talking about the sort of culture of single motherhood that's been created in the United States, it is not about custody hearings. It is about the fact that people are getting pregnant before they're married, out of wedlock, and having babies without a father even in the home. This is not to diminish the problems in custody battles. There's no question that a lot of custody law is biased toward the mother. That's been true for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. But to pretend that that is the main problem facing inner city communities, for example, ignores the fact that the vast majority of people who are having babies out of wedlock are having them out of wedlock. They're not having them in wedlock and then dad is taking off. Dad's taking off because they never got married. Okay, this is why marriage is a prerequisite.
Well, I believe, Ben, that if you look at, say, the south side of Chicago and the west side of Chicago, if you look at that and the crime that is there today, you can trace that back to Jim Crow, to the war on drugs, to mass incarceration. And when fathers were taken out in large numbers over a long duration, you now have set the stage where you have so many children being had out of wedlock because the family unit has broken down in these
No, the increase in single motherhood is not based in Jim Crow. Because the fact is that at the end of Jim Crow, the black single motherhood rate was 20%. Today it's 72%. Okay, so did society get more racist? How did that happen? Was it just a ticking time bomb that they left under the kitchen table? The fact is that people are having babies out of wedlock now because there are government structures in place that basically incentivize people to have babies out of wedlock, and that's the real problem. Now, in terms of crime, obviously crime is involved with single motherhood. What I'm suggesting is that there are two ways to tackle this problem. One is a broader cultural critique in which we say to people, you need to get married, and that means getting people involved in church and synagogue, getting people involved in a social network that encourages people to get married before they have babies. That's a long-term project because it takes 100 years for an entire society to devolve to the point where a majority of babies are being born out of wedlock in a community, or a vast minority in the white community. That's one way to tackle it. A shorter-term way to tackle crime is to put all the criminals in prison. Because again, I think that sets off a chain reaction that's actually good. And the chain reaction is that now you can have businesses invest. I'm not going to take my money and invest in a store that I think is going to be robbed tomorrow because the crime rate is high. I'm only going to invest where I think the cops are going to protect. And if there are no cops there to protect, it's hard for me to invest. Once I invest, that creates a property tax base or a local taxation base. And now you actually have the money, if you want a good public school, to actually put together a good public school. So all of these things need to happen at once. But the only quarrel I have with you at all is I think that you're taking an anecdote and expanding it out statistically where that's not actually statistically valid.
So you don't believe that the federal incentives to the states, for the states to receive federal funding based on their forced collection of child support?
No, I'm not arguing with you on that. You may very well be right. I don't know enough about that to answer that question. All I'm saying is that if you're talking about child support as the lead problem in these communities, there we disagree. I'm sorry, I have to move on because there's a lot of other questions.
Hi, I just want to say thank you for your talk today, and that's coming from someone who disagrees with basically everything you say.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
But yeah,
thank you for coming.
So today you had a Twitter thread in response to Ted Lieu's comments on health insurance and the CBO report that came out about why pre-existing conditions should be charged more. For those with pre-existing conditions that become priced out of the market due to them being charged more, which I understand your reasoning behind, car insurance, stuff like that. I read the thread.
Well, I mean, to reiterate my point for people who don't understand, just so if you're coming in late to this conversation, Ted Lieu tweeted something out about how it's ridiculous basically for insurance companies to charge people with pre-existing conditions more, to which I said, it's an insurance company, of course it does. I mean, every insurance company in history charges people more based on their risk profile. That's why you have risk assessors at insurance companies. So go ahead.
Yeah, my question is, for the people who are priced out of the market
due
to that, is their only solution to go without health care? And why do you think that's an acceptable solution when most other nations have found a solution?
No, I don't think that's an acceptable solution. I think what we need to do is we've trained now 3 generations of Americans to be dependent on the government to fill that gap. So there are a couple of ways that you can tackle these issues. The chief problem, and I think we all acknowledge this, is that people don't buy. Let's say that everyone were age 0 for a second. Okay, everyone was born today. How do you solve the healthcare problem? You don't really have to solve the healthcare problem because people, presumably, you train them to buy insurance when they're young. The big problem is people don't buy insurance when they're young. Now they're 60, they don't have insurance, they have pre-existing conditions, and now no one's going to cover them, right? So we all know that the problem in the future is not going to be people who are 65 because in 50 years, 40 years, 30 years, they'll be dead, right? The big problem is going to be people who are 20 who are not getting health insurance now, and then in 40 years they have a pre-existing condition, they look for health insurance. So if we're talking about the future and the future plans for healthcare, what we need to be doing is encouraging young people to buy health insurance. Well, there are only 2 ways to do that. One is to use the government to force people to buy health insurance, and the other way is to basically have a market system that punishes people for not buying health insurance. Okay, the way you have a market system that punishes people for not buying health insurance is you make it very clear to people that there's a moral hazard involved here, that if you don't buy health insurance, that you're going to be paying more in the long run, so you'd better, pay health insurance right now and make smart decisions about it. Now, for the people who fall through the cracks, as I say, there's 2 groups now that we're talking about. There's people who are old and have pre-existing conditions, and it's too late for them. What do we do? They can't go back to being 20 and buy health insurance when they were healthy, right? So for those people, obviously, we have to have some sort of backup that phases out over time, right? That doesn't work the same way for a 60-year-old as it works for a 40-year-old or a 30-year-old who can buy when they're healthy, because we want to encourage those people to buy, not to be relying on government. And there I'm not against the idea of a phased-out government program based on age that helps subsidize people in pre-existing condition situations. And the other thing is that you have to have private charity pick up the slack for a lot of this stuff. And this is where I've said that I think that private charity does pick up the slack for a lot of things. I mean, Jimmy Kimmel made obviously a big to-do when he did a routine on his show in which he talked about how his baby son had been born. They took him to Children's Hospital. He had an open heart surgery. And that's why you need Obamacare. Okay, Jimmy Kimmel didn't have Obamacare. Jimmy Kimmel had private insurance. The fact is that private insurance, which covers the vast majority of the market, is still covering of pre-existing conditions because when you are employed and you have insurance, you're pooled with all the other employees of your company. That's the way it works, right? right? They don't charge you more with a pre-existing condition, at least in huge numbers, when you're getting it through your employer. So that's problem number one with Jimmy Kimmel, is he already had health insurance. The problem number two that he didn't mention is that Children's Hospital is a charity hospital. A lot of people are coming in there with Medicaid, and the only way that people can get covered is not just through Medicaid, it's because there's a bunch of charity that's coming in and supplementing the Medicaid to pay the doctor. I know this because the doctor who operated on Jimmy Kimmel's son is a guy named Vaughn Starnes, and he operated on my daughter when she was 1.5 years old. So we were at the same hospital with the same doctor. The vast majority of patients there, I believe, were on Medicaid. And they were able to get care because of the charity that was involved. So my solutions are twofold. There's a long answer, but it's a complex question. So the answer is, one, private charity needs to be increased so that we can help pick up the slack, because if that doesn't happen, conservatives, note to us, we need to give more charity, because if we don't do it, the government's going to try to. Okay, and solution number two is that we have to have a phased out program that takes care of the people for whom it's too late to actually make good decisions, but still encourages people to make good decisions now about buying their insurance, which means there must be a risk attached to not buying insurance.
One last just one ending comment. Two things. First of all, if you're encouraging people to buy health insurance, at the age of 20 or an age like that, they're not going to have, the income or the percentage to donate as much to a better insurance plan, You don't need a terrific insurance plan when you're 20. You need a catastrophic insurance plan when you're 20. And the truth is that most of the time you need a catastrophic insurance plan generally. You shouldn't have to go to an insurance company if you have a flu. You should be able to go to a doctor and pay cash. And also, when you're 20, there are still people with pre-existing conditions that would jack up those costs, and getting it early might not help.
100%. But again, this is a time lapse question, because the fact is that my daughter was covered under my insurance, right? If you're under 20, you're covered on your parents' insurance typically. So, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Mr. Shapiro. Thank you for being here today. I'm sure it takes guts to say those things, especially at a place like Northwestern, so thank you.
It's fine, I do it for a living.
So you mentioned a couple of times about how there needs to be a national dialogue focusing on various social issues. Do you think that your caustic left versus right, liberal versus conservative language helps you change people's views, or do you think that your success, your fame, this tour that you're doing, comes from being a sounding board for people who already have established views very similar to yours?
So I think some of both. So I will agree that some of the things that I say are caustic. One of the reasons that I do this in caustic manner is because if you're entertaining people, then you're also getting them to listen to you. We live in an entertainment culture, and all of that is true. Second thing is, the reason that I do that is because the most common left argument against people on the right is
hello, everyone. Hey, I'm just stopping by to remind you that liberals are insane. Social justice warriors are becoming more violent and triggered than ever before. Anyways, be sure to subscribe to KGPTV on YouTube and have a blessed day. Yeah, man.
left. I mean, even Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren came out against Antifa and people trying to shut down Ann Coulter at Berkeley. If the right starts to embrace the same tactics that some members of the left have embraced in shutting down free speech in the name of shutting down hate speech, then the right is going to be just as guilty as the left in this political impasse we now find ourselves in.
And you were getting bashed all weekend, I saw, really not really from the right. It's not the right. They're not conservatives. It's the alt-right.
Well, that's no shock. I mean, the alt-right is not a right-wing movement. The alt-right is basically a grievance movement that is driven in response to the multicultural left. And
before this video starts, I'd just like to make an announcement. I have the Liberal Tears mug for $14.99 on my website. It is the first link in the description if you want to go pick one up. Don't worry if it breaks when it comes to your house. I'll send you another one for free out of my pocket. I don't care. I want you to get your Liberal Tear mug. It comes in Liberal Tears white with the face, black with the face, white without the face, and black without the face. So pick whichever one you want, and it'll come to your door in about 3 to 5 days. So that should be epic. First link in the description. Thank you. Let's go on with the video.
Joining us from Los Angeles, we have editor-in-chief of DailyWire.com, columnist Ben Shapiro. Over the weekend, he criticized these protests from the right, saying they adopt the tactics of the left, and Charlie Sykes is still with us.
Yeah, Charlie's still with us. So, Ben, we've been criticizing, what's happened up at Middlebury, and I say we around the set, but also conservatives have. What's happening in Berkeley all the time. And then, as you pointed out, these people on the alt-right have hijacked some of the worst traits of the far left and what they did with this play. Talk about it.
I've spent my career opposing idiot snowflakery. I go around and I speak at places like Cal State Los Angeles, and there's a near riot there. I go and speak at University of Wisconsin. People try to storm the stage, and I've always said this kind of stuff is not free speech when you're trying to censor somebody else's free speech. And then the right does it, and shockingly, there are members of the right, mainstream members of the right, who says, well, this is just turnabout as fair play. Well, no, if it's wrong when the left does it, it's wrong when you do it. And this idiotic notion that trying to promote snowflakery from the right is somehow going to combat the snowflakery from the left, it's so stupid. Especially because this stuff hasn't actually helped the left.
You are Nazis!
Okay, that was a disruption of Friday's performance of Shakespeare in the Park's production of Julius Caesar. The production was controversial, one because they had Caesar, who is killed, resemble the president.
Donald Trump. They had one that resembled Barack Obama several years ago.
The protesters called it, quote, the normalization of political violence against the right, and the blood of Steve Scalise is on your hands. The production closed yesterday, but not without being disrupted again by supporters of the president.